Welcome back to the channel. Once again, a 7-day FPS happened, and once again I have submitted a game for it. However, I wouldn't really call it much of a game. It's more of a continuation of the idea from last year in regards to alternate movement methods in VR, hence why I titled it The Path Experiment, because that's what it ultimately is, an experiment. So what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Well, I went over it in last year's 7-day FPS video, but I'll explain it again. VR games have two types of movement systems. You can either teleport around, which works well enough but can be immersion breaking, or direct movement, letting you move around your character with the stick. The problem with the latter is that this causes me to get motion sick. Unfortunately, teleporting often doesn't get added as an option, and direct movement more often than not becomes the sole movement option, meaning there are a whole bunch of VR games I can't play. Last year I wanted to see if I could make an alternative movement system and settled on moving a player along a set path. And it worked well enough. I didn't get motion sick, but at the same time the movement was limited to going straight or taking 90-degree turns. Hence why I wanted to expand on the idea in a few places. In this year's game, there are two levels. The first level is similar to last year's game in that you're moving around while enemies spawn. The second level has the player on the back of a pickup truck being chased through a city. And there's no procedural generation this time. For the first level, I've ditched the moving at a 90-degree angle stuff in favour of a more natural movement curve. It doesn't cause me any issues for the most part, but others may be affected. Let me know if it gives you any problems if you play it. The level itself is supposed to be an underground club with an attached office where shady business occurs. You don't just move along the path continuously like last year's game. There's two additional aspects I've added. Firstly, there's a point in the center of the dance floor where the player will stop and enemies will spawn around them. Secondly, once they reach the office space, the player's movement slows down a bit to make navigating the environment a bit less hectic. The former of those was meant to be a reoccurring mechanic, but seeing as the game is only 2 levels, that's the only place where it happens. And it's not a great implementation either, but the idea of standing your ground while enemies surround you is a reasonable idea. The rest of the enemies spawn via triggers that are placed along the path. The first level is really just an evolution of the original idea I talked about. It doesn't do much new, but it is functional. The second level is where things get a bit more interesting on the movement front. Originally, the second level was meant to be a helicopter sequence with a mounted gun attached, essentially a turret sequence. However, the vertical motion of it ended up making me feel awful, so I ditched it in favour of a pickup truck. I also ditched a mounted gun, but that's because I was too lazy to model, rig, and texture it to make it work in VR. On the subject of things I was too lazy to do, the original city plan was going to be multiple streets that the player would randomly go through. They'd hit a crossing and go left, right, or forward. I scrapped this for 2 reasons. Manually building out a bunch of roads to go off in different directions and various triggers needed for it is a pain, and the script I used to build the actual road mesh doesn't work with intersections, and I didn't really feel like fixing it. So I scrapped the idea in favour of just having a truck follow a path. Maybe not as technically interesting, but the point of the thing was to negate motion sickness, not figure out pathing. The truck goes through a city environment while cars spawn behind and chase you. You shoot them and they explode. Simple stuff, but it is somewhat reminiscent of car chase sequences you'd find in a game, like the one in Yakuza 0 or at the end of Call of Duty 4. Maybe don't think about it too hard. Either way, it does try to prove that these kinds of set pieces are at least possible. As for whether or not it makes me motion sick, it does take some getting used to, but I haven't had any serious issues. As long as I'm facing either the trucks forward or back, I have no real issues. The sides make me feel a bit odd, but nothing major. You guys should give it a go and let me know how it makes you feel. That's the general overview, so let's talk about more specific features. You've likely noticed by now, but there's more than one weapon. The second weapon is a submachine gun. I made and animated it myself. It's a little rough, but I'll be touching it up soon and making it available at a later date. But now that I have 2 guns, I had to figure out the best way to switch weapons. Although a lot of my ideas for gun handling are borrowed from Half-Life Alyx, I did find their method of switching weapons a tad unnatural. I came up with a solution where you would put your hand on different parts of your body and press the grip to switch weapons. And I thought this was a really novel idea until my friend pointed out to me that both Boneworks and Bone Lab already do it. Anyway, you put your hand behind your head for the SMG and behind your lower back for the pistol. There was also going to be a third weapon that was going to act as a shotgun, but due to problems beyond anyone's control, it couldn't get made in time. If it did get in, you would select it by putting your hand on the left side of your chest, sort of like how you would use a shoulder holster. The other semi-noteworthy feature is the AI. It's nothing wild. I set up a nav mesh for both levels. In the first level, enemies are in a container, with the actual enemy model and an empty object. The empty object acts as a destination point that the model moves to, which I set via navmesh's setDestination function. So when they spawn after the player hits a trigger point, they'll run out to where they need to be and enter a shooting stance. It gives the player a bit of time to react to them, rather than just spawning them immediately in front and having them shoot. For the dance floor section where the player is stopped briefly, there are actually multiple points around the pillars where the enemies spawn from. There were fewer originally, but there was an issue where enemies would run into each other instead of stopping and shooting the player. I never fixed the issue, and instead went with a far lazier method of just putting down more target points, hoping that the more options there were, the less likely it would be for the enemies to have the same target. It does still happen on occasion. As for the enemy cars in the second level, they are in a similar container setup as before, with a model and a destination point. However, instead of manually setting the destination, it now follows the same spline that the player is on, with a slight offset on the relative x-axis so that each car isn't always directly behind the player, adding a bit more to the believability. I was actually somewhat surprised by how well it turned out. Neither of these setups are particularly complicated, but they work well enough. The animations for the human enemies could be better, but it would take a lot more time than I have, and a lot more effort than it's probably worth. Well, that's it. If the game seems a bit half-assed, that's because it kind of is. VR development is a pain. Between Unity's mountain of scripts you have to use, and the constant putting on and off the headset every time I need to test any small change, it just gets tiring. Plus, it narrows down the potential audience that can play the game. Most people don't have a headset, or if they do, it's a standalone one, but they don't have a powerful enough PC to hook it up to. I've had my fill of VR development. I'm not going to make another VR game, unless there's a substantial change to the technology. But I will make another game for 7-day FPS. Believe me, I've still got plenty of ideas I want to try. So what's coming up in the new year? Global Game Jam is happening in January. I'm going to try and make something for it in GB Studio because I'm curious about it. Although I'll be helping my friend with some Godot stuff as well. The SMG I made will be improved and fixed up and released as a standalone asset, much like the pistol from last year, and if my friend and I are able to do it, we will also release the gun that wasn't able to make it in. I'm not sure on the timeline for either of these, so make sure to follow my itch.io page for updates. I'm going to update my stream graphics again, fixing up a few details and improving the presentation. It's not going to be an overhaul, just an improvement. I'm also going to update my on-screen avatar as it's very out of date. I've got 2 videos I'm going to be working on for this channel, a rigging tutorial for animating guns, and a video about that fighting game that's listed on my itch page. Finally, Cyber Surfer. There's still a lot to fix in regards to player handling, but once that's done, it can finally progress past the prototype stage. I'd like to get it into an early access stage at some point next year, but that's probably wishful thinking. That's it for now. I'll see you again in February for the inevitable video about Global Game Jam. There are various links in the description below if you want to follow me on Twitch or support me on Ko-fi, and I'll see you next time.